Greetings and welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Safest Family on the Block, where knowledge is power. I'm your host, Jason, and joining me today is Filippo Marino. Hello, sir. How are you doing today?
Hi, Jason. Doing great. Thank you. How about you?
I'm doing fantastic so far. Now, we're really fortunate to have Filippo today because over the course of his career, he has led or optimized security, intelligence and risk mitigation operations as an advisor and a functional leader. His career started as an officer of the Italian Army, has spanned across organizational and cultural boundaries, serving as a successful consultant to Fortune 500 companies, high net worth individuals. He's authored several guidelines and operational frameworks and patented business models adopted by corporate intelligence and protective security. And he is now in charge of SafeEsteem, which is an app both for the corporate world and more recently for the personal world that helps people assess the safety of their own lives, especially in terms of travel. So we've got a lot of experience and a lot of passion coming in today, and I really appreciate you coming to join us.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I love what you're doing with the podcast and the videos.
Oh, you're too kind. And we found out about SafeEsteem because Chris Story mentioned you guys in our episode on advanced
All
work
right.
for families. And so let's kind of start there about SafeEsteem, what it is and what it does. We'll kind of go out from there into some of the more esoteric topics.
Yeah, sure. So,
Hmm.
well, first of all,
Yeah.
SafeEsteem starts as an effort, an initiative, an app that
Hmm.
we launched about 5 years ago with a very ambitious goal, fundamentally one of improving the way we all measure, understand, communicate, and ultimately decide upon our personal risk. Um, we are a technology startup. We're doing that by blending traditional human intelligence with artificial intelligence
Hmm.
and big data analytics and a lot of cognitive behavioral science research. Um, and we are in the background building, if you will, a very complex and ambitious app, which will eventually allow us to measure our individual risks in real time. Call it the equivalent of a personal safety barometer, if you will.
Hmm.
In the meantime, and along the path, we have developed an interim app called SafeExplore. SafeExplorer was built originally for the protective intelligence and executive protection and travel risk intelligence analyst world. So it's really the world that we come from, if you will, the corporate security departments that attend to the safety and security of the C-suites, their CEO, and other at-risk
Hmm.
personnel. And we build that a fairly sophisticated travel risk application for the analysts. But then, with COVID impacting everybody, we decided to actually share our risk models with the general public, and only recently released the SafeExplore Personal Edition, which is really a free, light version, if you will, of this analyst tool.
Hmm. And one of the things I appreciate about the analysis you're putting together on that, when we spoke earlier, just kind of to get a sense of whether or not you wanted to come on the show, we were talking about how what people think about when they assess risk is very rarely what we should be paying attention to when we assess risk. For example, on just the episodes of the podcast, if I bring on a CIA agent or a bodyguard or a seventh degree black belt to talk about how to lay the smackdown on the bad guys, those get lots of hits and views. But when I have a paramedic to come on talking about first aid or a traffic cop to talk about driving safety, fewer views. And then my lowest performing one ever was a nutritionist who came on to talk about nutrition as a family safety factor. And even though what he had to say undoubtedly will affect the largest number of people in North America, we
Mm-hmm.
had the smallest number of views on that episode.
Yeah, it's a great observation. And by the way, the very basis of I guess our impetus to build SafeEsteem, and hence the name itself, by the way, which is this idea of our ability to really understand, estimate what is likely to injure or kill us. Okay, in this concept of risk, is really it's something that more and more people are becoming aware of. Is really a very ambiguous, often misunderstood, and culturally driven concept. It's many of us think of ourselves as pretty rational being, and potentially even pretty sharp and smart about understanding threats, hazards, and the risks that can affect us. Maybe thanks to our instincts that are often being depicted as being fine-tuned over evolution to ensure our survival. It turns out that we're actually terrible at judging risks. Okay, most humans are actually very poorly calibrated machines when it comes to evaluating risks, and we tend to use a slew of other decision, if you will, points rather than actual probabilities. Okay, so it's a enormously ambiguous, complex, culturally shaped concept, and this is quite timely because, as you know, in fact, we live in a particularly challenging time from a personal risk standpoint due to a global pandemic. But the pandemic itself, if you will, has really shed a bright light on the complexity of this assessment, right? On how our interpretation of threats and hazards is really driven more by, again, sentiments, feelings, even maybe ideology, political affiliation, than it is by actual numbers.
No, that makes sense. I think one example, you talk about how our assessment of risk and assessment of safe behavior is driven in part culturally. And just look at, for example, the fortunately getting rarer, but still kind of very present narrative that real men eat steak and you don't order a salad, right? And that's a safety-based decision that is driven by weird cultural perceptions that have nothing to do with the numbers.
Absolutely, you're absolutely. In fact, by the way, there's plenty of research that shows that the way an individual will interpret and or respond to a specific threat or hazard in the environment can be predicted more by their political affiliations, in other words, their so-called social identity, than by their even education, numeracy, or professional background.
So what's an example of that in real time? Like what's...
Well, again, we talked about COVID. Okay, so and COVID is a perfect example of the again the way by which we attribute a certain degree of danger to specific hazards based on, if you will, the social identity rules. So in other words, what our particular in-group is saying about that particular hazard. So for example, this applies to the concept of, nuclear power, whether it is really, when we make a calculation of that risk, is it something to support or to object to, because of the threat that it poses to humanity. The truth is that most people don't have the actual numbers or the numeracy, or so they tend to fundamentally embrace the position of their in-group, their social, how they feel they're affiliated socially to a certain ideology. And that is true, by the way, of an enormous number of risks and threats and hazards. And that has to do with the fact that there's a number of things that conspire against us in this sense. Okay, first of all, because number one, risks are really a statistical and probabilistic concept. There's no other way to put it. So risk, fundamentally, if we define it in the most, if you will, the most basic and universal form. And again, the definitions of risk, by the way, vary between professions, cultures, and so forth. However, let's say that, especially from the individual standpoint, which is really, if you will, your audience, right? The individual, the family. So let's think about it and define it as the likelihood of an adverse outcome. Okay, so it's fundamentally a concept that is about the future and is about probabilities. So there is no way to talk about risk without numbers, statistics, probability. Okay, and we fundamentally are terrible at statistics. It's really not a particularly friendly topic. It's not something that we have a very big education in. It's not something that is familiar to us. And it's not the way our mind really interprets the environment. We use experience. We use, our anecdotes. We use storytelling. So the first part that renders this conversation complicated and our judgment often fallible is the fact that it's fundamentally a difficult concept. It's not an intuitive concept. It's difficult, and requires considerable amount of numeracy. The other problem is that because it is so tied to a universal and fundamental need of the human species, which is the need to survive and thrive. Now, whether you look at it from the standpoint of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or you look at it purely from a standpoint of biogenetics and how our brains are wired fundamentally to protect our bodies from threats and hazards, bottom line, we all share this need to survive and thrive. And that tells us that this particular topic, anything that addresses the issue of, am I safe? Is my family safe? Are my kids safe? Am I going to survive today or tomorrow? Those things have an enormous emotional tie. Okay, I like to say sometimes that people don't speak enough about their personal risk and their safety, because the topic is a little bit like talking about sex. It's one of those things that makes people uncomfortable. and for various reasons, again, because there's a sense that somehow it may invite a risk, or maybe another reaction is that typical of the fatalist, the one that says, oh, there's only so much you can control, we're in God's hands, and so there's various reasons by which we don't talk about it, and we carry with us, which is the third point, a considerable amount of ambiguity. So all you need to do is literally ask your friends, what do you think your risks are? And you realize that this word risk is really so ill-defined. Are you talking about, for example, illness and disease? Are you talking, or are we talking about the risk of criminal victimization? Are we talking about the risk of financial ruin. You know, we bundle so many things in this, and we rarely narrow the conversation down to the point where we can have a meaningful conversation about numbers. And rather, we stay in the domain of, if you will, emotions, beliefs, and so forth. So it's a challenging topic. You know, anyone who tries to say otherwise, it's fundamentally underestimating it or lying to you. It's not easy to talk about risk.
That makes really good sense. It's unfortunate that it makes sense, but it does. I mean, for example, on one side we have numbers, statistics, abstract things that require removal from the immediate or removal from the emotional to understand and engage with. And on the other side, you have these emotional, visceral images in our heads of what could happen. You know, when the classic example being, you can think about the statistics of traffic accidents on the way to the beach, or you can think about the last time you saw Jaws.
Yeah.
We are wired to think about the last time we saw Jaws.
Correct. So, so again, this is a good opportunity maybe to talk about, you know, the proof of the fact. You know, what you're talking about, by the way, actually taking a step back, is one of the most classic debate and subjects of conversation when it comes to our risk perception, judgment, and decision making. Okay, and this is actually a debate that goes on amongst the general public, and believe it or not, amongst almost all professionals of risk, and that is the so-called experience and anecdotal and, if you will, instinctual approach to risk judgment, your gut feelings, okay, versus the actuarial statistical. Which one to believe? Now, you'd be interested, and you probably know this already, but there is literally very popular literature that emphasizes either point. There's a famous book, by the way, that became extremely popular that I think probably most of your viewers heard about, if not read. It's called Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, right? Then, of course, people that are really into, that have a military background, that have read of Left of Bang, you know, these are books that became very, very popular that really emphasize and try to unpack the incredible value and almost miraculous efficacy of our gut instincts. On the other hand, there are plenty of probably a little more academic and research books that really emphasize, in fact, one of them is called Never Go With Your Guts. Okay, and really explain how, in fact, our instincts are most of the time wrong. So in general, the public is left with, who should I believe? And what we work on a lot and with SafeEsteem is actually trying to identify under what circumstances is one true, and under what circumstances is the other true. Okay, and so what is clear is that our instincts are actually, and our judgment of risk is actually extraordinarily biased. Okay, and the one that you brought up earlier as an example of the shark is actually a perfect example of probably the single most impactful and devastating bias when it comes to risk judgment. And it's known as the availability bias or heuristic. Now, turns out that people address it as a bias with a negative attitude. The reality is that availability heuristic is extraordinarily important for us to operate in life, because we need to recall things all the time and assume that they repeat, and in fact, they allow us to function. However, when it comes to risk, what that availability bias does, it can be explained, or heuristic does, it can be explained as such. We fundamentally tend to overestimate the likelihood of events or threats or risks that are more available to our imagination or thinking. That availability equates saliency, gore, in other words, things that impress us. Okay, sometimes also recency. So, and how does that translate aside from in our everyday judgment and decision? Let's say, other than the shark example that you posed. So, in practical terms, let's address like a disease like COVID-19 or cancer. So, as long as this hazard is a number, and we don't necessarily have extremely really disturbing images associated with it, which instead you can imagine would be like being eaten alive by a shark, or maybe being blown up to pieces by a terrorist. But people in a hospital bed, we're used to them. They don't impress us as much. Okay, so but what happens is that instead, the moment we have maybe a family member in the hospital and we see them under those conditions, right? Or we have our sisters or brothers and everything die of cancer because they smoked, all their life. Now, suddenly, that hazard becomes much more available to us. It's much more meaningful, right? It's more salient. So we change our rating, which is again an indication that it is one of the ways by which we understand that unfortunately we're not this computer that is capable of estimating, the likelihood or probability of these things vis-a-vis others. We just use these other tools, such as, oh yes, I've been there, I've experienced this, I've seen a movie, and that influences how we rank that particular risk. Does that make sense?
It does. It's kind of the opposite of when I was studying psychology in college. We had a thing called the freshman fallacy, which was basically somebody would read a study that made an assertion about how humans behave, and then you'd read that and go, well, but my cousin Billy doesn't do that, so this obviously is BS. And it's the same, different sides of the same idea, that our immediate experience and our, like you said, our vibrant experience, our visceral experience outweighs the cold numbers.
Yes, look. In fact, believe it or not, there's this very fancy, term that describes our again our bias for personal experience, anecdotes, storytelling versus actual statistics and numbers that are a lot more informative when are things that fundamentally affect our lives over time. And that's called, academics call it base rate neglect, which I like to say is fundamentally the academic way to say that we just suck at statistics. We're just terrible. So we tend to ignore them in favor of a story. So in fact, the example that you brought up about the freshman brings up a fantastic point that drives us back to the, when do we trust our instincts and when should we instead ignore them, right? And because we understand that statistics are actually, when it comes to risk, are a lot more informative in predicting the future than our experience. you can really look at these two ways of making decisions, which are our experience and the anecdotes. You know, that there is one particular incident that occurred recently, again, speaking of COVID-19, that where this celebrity, Kylie Minaj, posted on social media that her cousin had a bad reaction to the vaccine, right? So the famous "my cousin." So and this is a fallacy that, as you know, has been going on forever, right? Is this also, from a practical standpoint, that's called the small sample size, right? Fallacy. So it's. However, now it's been renamed almost the Nicki Minaj fallacy, because she made it even more famous. Okay, so if we look at that versus, okay, what does the data tell us from clinical studies, from random sampling of significant numbers of people in very large population sets? That's exactly when we recognize how our instincts can lead us astray, because it's almost impossible for us to ignore that personal experience. So you can go to Mexico City, or you can go to Guatemala City 10 times, and what will happen is that you will inevitably develop a sense of how safe or unsafe it is. It's almost impossible for you to resist. The truth is that somebody with a high SafeEsteem, how we call it, okay, it's somebody that actually has a healthy curiosity and skepticism about their own judgment when it comes to safety and security and risk assessment. And what would this person do? This person would say, I learned a lot in these trips, and I understand the environment much better than I did before, because now I understand what it looks like. I can see how people kind of drive around the streets, right? I can understand at what point, how many people I can expect on the street, and how people operate in daytime versus nighttime. All of these things are invaluable. They enable you to operate more effectively in that environment. So experience is not, we're not suggesting here that experience is not valuable. On the contrary, it's fundamental. But where it becomes disinforming or delusional is when we take that experience and we determine a risk rate, which again is something that we can't help ourselves do. Because if you have to make that determination, right, but how dangerous is it? Is it more or less dangerous than at home? Is it, for example, is the commute from the airport to downtown more or less dangerous than the commute of my daily routine where I drop off the kids at school? Believe it or not, you can't help yourself. You're going to put those on a scale. And you're going to say, this is a little more or a little less. And therein lies, unfortunately, the error. Because that rating is impossible to do in your head. Your 10 times, visit, to that city is fundamentally insignificant and really non-informative from the standpoint of risk. Because you could be going 100 times there. You could be going 100 times to San Pedro Sula, which is probably one of the most dangerous cities, in the Western Hemisphere, along with Caracas or St. Louis. And nothing happens to you. And you're going to take that as an indication that the place is not particularly dangerous. So you see, this is where, again, building, say, a higher SafeEsteem, it's fundamentally recognizing that there's a lot of value and experience in situational awareness and understanding the environment and interpreting our circumstances, reacting to that. But where we have to exercise our so-called slow brain and not trust our guts, then at that point, is when we try to quantify that risk and put it on a scale, which is what we do with diseases, which is what we do with, if you will, other health hazards, what we do with crime risks or the likelihood of incidents.
So maybe to kind of wrap this up in an illustration with a city that I've been to a lot, Singapore, which is widely regarded as extremely safe. It's like Disneyland for grown-ups, but it's not 100% safe. Where I've been a lot of times, so I have some experience with that, but that doesn't give me any real insights into how dangerous the city is in general. My experience could be very different because I stayed in the tourist zones or because I'm walking around like an American, and some countries kind of try to discourage victimizing Americans because it causes a big old kerfluffle. Whereas the statistics, the crime statistics, the health and safety statistics, the traffic statistics, those are what I should use to decide whether or not I'm going to go to Singapore with my kids. But my personal experience in Singapore about the neighborhoods, of what the baseline noise level seems like, what people usually wear, what people act, that's the information I should lean on while staying safe after having decided to go to Singapore.
That's exactly correct. So that famous base rate that is really, and by the way, sometimes those base rates are not available all the time. Okay, that's not necessarily true, because sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes they're subject to let's say inconsistent reporting. I don't need to tell you, the reporting on crime in Singapore is actually extremely reliable, credible, and well done. But if going back to Guatemala City, I can tell you those numbers are terrible. So you have to first of all find a credible source and try to compare apples to apples. But those are always more informative as long as you understand, if you will, if you're the confidence, if you're the interval, the degree of error that might be in them. They're always more accurate and indicative, and what to use when it comes to the prior decision to go. Then, if you will, I've been there 5 times. So, which leads us to a great point again. But when do you trust your instincts? So you see, turns out that most people, the error that we were making before, it's what is known as generalizing from the particular. The Nicki Minaj mistake. Okay, so in other words, my cousin, or it's called, it's a typical statistical error. You generalize from a small sample or your own experience, and you think, now I understand the big picture. But believe it or not, you can make the opposite mistake, which is just as severe, which is particularizing from the general. In other words, you're not a statistic. When you are in a location and the circumstances, and you're at present time, this is where your situational awareness, your ability to interpret the environment and the circumstances and the events as they unfold actually takes precedence. What does that mean? It doesn't really help you if you are on a cruise ship to quote the statistic that only 1 in 25,000 cruises actually sinks. Because if you're sinking, you have to pay attention to the fact that you're sinking. It doesn't, statistics at that point are irrelevant, right? So you have to be able to still maintain the reality and the experience in the moment and the proper interpretation. Now, it's true, of course, that you could misinterpret the environment if you don't understand the statistics for a lot of hazards, because unfortunately, not all threats and hazards come in such, if you will, easily identifiable form vis-a-vis, okay, somebody is being aggressive towards you. There is a bunch of drunk and aggressive people at the restaurant that you're sitting in, even if you're in a safe city. That's something you want to pay attention to, because regardless of how safe the city's rated, if you're nearby a bunch of drunk, aggressive people, you want to take precautions. You want to protect yourself. But unfortunately, again, not all threats and hazards, and in particular, the ones that we are more likely to encounter in a highly developed industrial society such as ours, are unfortunately visible. Again, case in point, COVID-19. You could be walking into a room at a meeting, and you fundamentally, you might be doubling or tripling your chance of dying because of those people having a low vaccination rate, not wearing masks, not social distancing. But that's not visible to you, you see. So unless you have the data, your experience would be useless, because they don't look dangerous. There's no sign of danger. So, but then again, the so-called high SafeEsteem and the smart, if you will, the smart interpreter of risk, and will begin by understanding the base rates. So what are really the risks? I mean, am I more likely to suffer a motor vehicle accident or a heart attack, or being the victim of a mass shooting, or so they will understand that the base rate. So and why is that important? But for two reasons. One, because fearing too much, or worrying too much, or about the wrong thing, fundamentally leads to anxiety, poor judgment and decision making, and increased likelihood of victimization or accidents. It's just, we're worrying about the wrong thing. Why would you want to, and also, here's the other interesting find, is that one of the top rationalizations for people to retain their ambiguity about risk, not talking about personal risk, right? Or not wanting to understand or dive deeper into the actual statistics and the numbers, has to do with the fact that it's either, as I said, it cannot be calculated. It's either unreachable, right? It's too complicated. People don't know anything about it. And that's, of course, a really silly skepticism, because if you ask your insurance provider, actually, they're pretty darn good at estimating what's likely to happen to you, and they make good money on it. So, but the other is that somehow it's going to elevate anxiety. This is often, especially for parents or mothers, who tend to say, I can't be thinking about all of these risks, right? Because that may actually just make my life a nightmare. Because if I start thinking, well, turns out that the opposite is true. You see, we are hardwired to worry and to pay attention to anything that can injure or kill us, or cause us harm, and especially our children, right? We're hardwired. You like it or not, all you need to do is try to clap your hands hard, and people will startle, right? So it's a genetic design issue. Now, turns out that it is the ambiguity and uncertainty about what is likely to cause us harm that actually drives anxiety, rather than the actual understanding and fair assessment of what it is. Today, So we were discussing a recent American Psychological Association survey that said that 7 out, or nearly 8 out of 10 Americans express concern and anxiety of the likelihood of being victims in a mass shooting incident. And that actually 1 in 3, 30% of respondents suggest that they're actually either already taking action or considering action of avoiding certain events or location for fear of ending up in a mass shooting incident. Now, you see, consider the effects of uncertainty, of the likelihood of this happening. Is it possible? How likely is it? How is it compared, for example, instead of being victim of a car accident, or contracting a communicable disease, or having a heart attack?
Mhm.
Because people don't know those numbers, so they tend to literally actually shape their behavior to the extent that they will either not do things that they might want to do,
Mhm.
or ultimately live at an increased level of anxiety that is really tragic.
There's a to illustrate that point. I became aware of it about a year and a half ago, but there's a fairly profitable business niche of making kids backpacks with a little slat for your trauma plate.
Yeah.
So your kid can have a bullet resistant backpack. But as
Yeah.
tragic as those incidences are, and as responsible I think we are as a culture to figure out what's going on there and stop them, the numbers are a rounding error compared
Yeah.
to traffic accidents and other
Yeah.
less visceral but more present hazards.
Yeah. I'm afraid there's no shortage of profiteering around
Mhm.
fear.
Yeah.
In fact, you'll probably have seen the increasing prevalence and popularity of mobile apps that fundamentally send you alerts of issues in your neighborhood and everything,
Mhm.
under the guises that you increase your awareness. The reality, all these apps are doing, they're fundamentally elevating your high blood pressure,
Mhm.
triggering your autonomic nervous system or fight or flight, and fundamentally telling you there's a hazard there, so you can't help yourself but looking at them. And and then ultimately really fueling that availability bias, because you're going to hear, oh, there's been 2 break-ins in our neighborhood, now this risk of break-in and the risk to my family. Then you conflate the risks of break-in with
Mhm.
violent crime. You conflate the two, and next thing you know, you start believing that you live in very dangerous times.
Wasn't
and
there
that's
was
not
one that
necessarily the case.
Yeah, there was one that got in the news fairly recently that I can't remember the exact details, but they were making that specific thing part of their business model, like explicitly, that they were, creating a
Yeah.
false sense of fear in order to make money. And for some reason, I can't remember whether there were some transcripts from a meeting or some internal documents that got leaked, but their approach was exactly that. Not only that, but cynically that.
Yes.
And it's probably true of a lot of them, but those guys apparently admitted it in public. Uh,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that brings us around to, I think, this is something humans do. We assess risk
Yeah.
poorly, and we
Mm-hmm.
are vulnerable to manipulation by people to make money, people looking to foster political power, people looking to foster influence. What can we best do as parents? Because overcoming uh, that inclination, I think, is one of our
Mm-hmm.
key responsibilities if we're sitting here trying to keep little helpless humans safe. And let's start a little bit with SafeExplore is the civilian model of the tool that you're putting
Mm-hmm.
together. Could you tell us a little bit about what does that do for us? How does that help us with this?
So the starting
Mm-hmm.
point of that is is to uh, take a first step into, again, what we call risk judgment calibration.
Okay.
Which is really this effort of trying to say, okay, we knowing that we tend to be drawn to things driven by
Mhm.
forces other than actual likelihood and probability, which is really the language of risk. The first thing to do is to understand of things that are really likely to harm or even kill me. How are they distributed? See, most people, again, because crime tends to be a lot more, tends to impress us,
Mhm.
right? And become a lot more available to our imagination than, for example, I'm afraid, the good old disease,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
health problems, okay? Um, Most people tend to then completely skew their judgment. In fact, we conducted a
Mhm.
big survey and we showed that when you ask them, just try to give me a sense if you are, let's say, I don't know, 35 years old or 50 years old, how do these three domains of risk compare to each other, relative to each other, right? Which is health, accidents, and crime. And most people end up answering one third, one third, one third.
Hmm.
So, which is a typical answer when you don't know the answer. Because you say, well, whatever, I start thinking, so they all three seem reasonable, and,
Mhm.
so I kind of distribute it, which is an extraordinary overestimation of the likelihood of violent crime, victimization.
Mhm.
Okay, and an extraordinary underestimation of actually health risks. So the majority of risks for most people are just come from the health domain, health and disease domain. Okay, and then second are typically accidents, and then finally really violent crime. So, which is like typically a single-digit percentage of the likelihood of victimization, with the exception maybe if you're a male, the ages between
Mhm.
15 and 29, okay, where violence tend to have a higher impact. Now,
And to be
so
clear with that
going
statistic, it's not that being a male of that age means you're more likely to be a victim of a crime. It's because you're far less likely to die in general. So the
correct.
number goes up.
But by the way, both a little
Yeah.
bit.
Mhm. Yeah.
Meaning that not only because relative to other things, let's face
Mhm.
it, when you're in your
Yeah.
20s, the likelihood of you ending up in a hospital because of a health problem is very low,
Very low.
So,
Yeah.
so obviously
Mhm.
relative, crime is much higher. But it is also true that
Mhm.
violent crime is a story of young men.
Yeah.
Okay,
Because we
that's
are dumb. We
so
are
so
dumbasses.
yeah, pretty much, yeah, and there's
Mhm.
much more, I guess, tendency to escalate things. So
Mhm.
now, what does the app do? The first step is to say, okay, well, you sign up, you give us
Mhm.
your age, gender, and where you live, and we can already tell you how your risks are distributed. So you
Mhm.
begin that process of recalibrating your thing, because most people have such high anxiety these days that they tend to
Mhm.
think, oh, the increase in violent crime, or we're living in unprecedented violent crime risk, which by the way is completely false.
Mhm.
Even though we have seen an increase in violent crime, more specifically about homicide rate, which was significant in the last year, we're still way below
Mhm.
what we were in the 1990s alone, let alone prior centuries. So that said, so we start, and people get to see for the first time, for their age and gender and location, what is it that are, how are these sources of
Mhm.
risk,
Mhm.
distributed, okay, relative to each other. So you can calm down a little bit and say, okay, Bill, if it's health, let me see what's more likely to happen. And
Mhm.
second, we take the risk of, for example, right now being an acute condition that most people are most concerned with, that is
Mhm.
impeding the return to normal life. It's impeding traveling for either leisure or business. So it's the risk of COVID, right? Now, turns out, of course, for vaccinated people, that risk is almost normalized to other risks, whereas we can still show the value, or the if you will, the mitigation practices and the vaccination versus the not having it, by doing something that we do naturally. And if you recall at the
Mhm.
beginning of the discussions of how do we measure this health hazard, the first natural tendency is to compare it to other things. So we compared it to the flu. Remember? So, because that's our natural tendency for us to give it a scale where we don't have real numbers. Well, how is it compared to this? It's just the same thing that we do, by the way, with violent crime risk. And how does a certain city compare to my home city? That's how we understand the risk a lot better, rather than me telling you that the violent crime victimization rate is 700 per 100,000, which makes sense to me or somebody who's into statistics. It doesn't make sense to anyone, in the street. But what does make sense to almost everyone is, well, I'm familiar with my environment. I have a certain expectation of my life risks. Well, what does, for example, COVID-19 add to that risk? How does it compare to my risk of dying from a communicable disease or all other diseases? Does it double my life risk? Does it just add 10%? And we do that in real time. So we really take that particular risk, we make it dynamic, and we make it specific for the age and gender of the individual. But the other part that is extremely, of course, more and long-term useful is for any trip or any travel. For the first time ever, the general public, through this application, can actually see the comparison between a destination and their home in terms of violent crime victimization risk, rather than on an arbitrary scale, but rather as a percentage increase or decrease based on actually rates and ratios. So that's really what tells me, for somebody of my age and gender, going to New Orleans means that my risk go actually up 30% or 40%, or they go down for others. You see, and that is, and that's what we do for the first time in a unique way, which is we adopt the understanding not only of or the availability of big data, which, to be frank with you, it was not, it became really available in recent years, to really be able to break down the demographic victimization likelihood. That this ability to build these statistical model is relatively new at this hyperlocal level. And the second is the use of cognitive behavioral science in this whole world of risk communication, because you're probably hearing it as we speak. Notice that even the CDC is being accused of failing to communicate this risk. It's really one of the most significant, if you will, outcomes of this pandemic is the challenges that as a society we still encounter in effectively communicating risk. And that's what we try to address with Safe Explorer, which what it does, it tells me, first of all, it allows you to compare over 200 domestic cities, which most travel apps don't do. We have over 200 US cities and over 190 international cities. And it provides you, in addition to that specific risk comparison, it provides you a baseline of the scale that is being used behind it with an index, so that you see how these cities fit vis-a-vis other cities. And ultimately, it gives you access then to the 3 public sources that are most credible and selected in English language for the context information, if you will, which is the Overseas Security Advisory Council of the US Department of State. It's the Australian traveler security, the Australian government travel security website, and the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office traveler information site. They're all there for you, one click away, to then go in and study the, if you will, the context of that particular country. And that is when you do an international trip.
I want to underscore one of the things that you mentioned there, that you have domestic cities in there as well.
Yeah.
For example, I gave serious thought to, when I traveled to Southeast Asia, about whether it was safe to then go there with my kids, but we go to St. Louis once a year. And St. Louis is no picnic.
Yeah.
And that, I think that can, especially for Americans, put into perspective the relative safety and risk associated with having more exotic and interesting travel. Because I mean, a lot of people go to Miami.
Yeah. Yeah, this is part again of one of those, if you will, alternative rules that we use to rate the risk of a destination rather than actual data and probability is actually what we call familiarity. So this seems pretty, I think, intuitive to most, is that whatever looks and appears really foreign and difficult to interpret because it's unfamiliar, right? The way people dress, the way streets are lined up, the architecture of the place, the street signs. Well, all of those things translate in our mind into risk. The more familiar things are, the more we tend to believe that we understand and the circumstances, and thereby we kind of minimize the risk. And therein lies the challenge that you just alluded to of going to New Orleans or St. Louis versus, I don't know, Mexico City or maybe Sao Paulo, Brazil. Well, both those cities in the United States are substantively more dangerous from a violent crime standpoint than even Mexico City or Sao Paulo. But for most people, that's really unintuitive. And there are certainly other factors to be considered, which is, there's a degree of, I guess, safety challenges. There are some safety challenges that come with the fact that you may not speak the language very well. You have a lack of familiarity with the rules and the ability maybe to interpret the environment more effectively. Sure. But the bottom line is that the likelihood of being the victim of a violent crime, of a serious violent crime, is nearly 2 or 3 times as high in those U.S. cities than it is in the ones that I mentioned earlier. So it drives us to, well, what can you do? Because I think that's what you were alluding to in an earlier question that I took the liberty probably to deviate from a little bit. But so what is it that you can do? Are there ways to improve that SafeEsteem, right? Can you no, I wish I had the one answer, okay, and the one step that solves it all. But again, because it is a very innate and complex subject, there are certainly a number of tricks that, or hacks that we can use to improve that quality of judgment. And the first is the one that most important one, is the one that I alluded to earlier. And that is to really begin to adopt a healthy curiosity and skepticism about this concept of personal risk and safety. Rather than setting it aside and thinking that ambiguity is what we need, because otherwise we suffer some kind of increased anxiety about this topic, I recognize the opposite. That number one, understanding more what is likely to injure or kill you is actually liberating and empowering, right? Because you can make smarter, better decisions. It's not more stressful. What is stressful is not understanding or understanding poorly what is likely to injure or kill you.
It's very much like how people often feel like they have a little bit wealthier as soon as they go on a budget. Because if you're not on a budget, you worry every time you go out to dinner. But if you're on a budget, well, I got $200 to go to dinner. And it's the same. It's the exact same kind of thing, I think. Yeah.
It's a great analogy. You're absolutely correct. It's a little bit that idea and said, well, if I don't think about it, maybe nothing's going to happen. And we all know how that's not the case in finance, right?
So hope is not a plan.
So that's the same thing
Oh,
with personal risk and safety. And the other is when I
mhm,
said skepticism, I mean
mhm,
to begin to maybe acknowledge by looking at the evidence. So maybe the way we feel about thing and our rating system is not super
mhm,
accurate. We're not a supercomputer about risk rating. And so which leads us to step number two, which then what can you do to make it better? Well, number one, one thing that you can do is to what what most risk intelligence professionals do, which is what is this, we use the term disambiguate.
mm,
Stop talking about risk in such generic terms and start diving down when people tell you, oh, this is more risk than that. But what are you talking about? Are you
mm,
talking about, again, becoming the victim of violent crime? Or am I talking about getting my purse snatched? You see, for
mm,
example, when you go to a travel destination, there are plenty of cities where street crime is very high. Take especially several
mm,
cities in Southern Europe, like take Southern Italy, where I was originally born, or take some parts of Argentina. So where you really have to pay attention to your belongings, right? Your watch may be stolen, your wallet, and everything. But we tend to then conflate those with the risk of being really assaulted or killed, which
mm,
I have nothing to do with the other. In fact, they're much safer than most U.S. cities when it comes to really serious violent crime. So by disambiguating and starting to decide what are we talking about, and not falling victim of the propaganda and this idea, oh, everything is a hazard.
mm,
What are we talking about?
mhm,
Break it up into small pieces because those can be measured and understood. When you create ambiguity, you can't measure it and you just tap into emotions. And finally, here's a great trick, which applies to fundamentally comes from the school of other decisions in life, such as diet or finances and everything. So you have to separate your present self from your future self.
mhm,
Okay. So the anytime you have to make a decision for your children of going to a certain school, commute in a certain way, take a trip somewhere by yourself or with your family, you are thinking about risk, and that is a future statement. A future statement demands it is much more informed by statistical and probability. So that's where forget about your past experience, look at numbers. Those are much more predictive
mhm,
than any of your past experience and everything. The numbers are much more effective if you know how to find them. They have to be accurate for sure. Not all numbers are true, not all statistics, but the reality is that it's a statistical function. And that's when you can forget, if you will, your guts. However, when you're in the present, that's when you can rely on your instinct. Pay attention to your environment. If you hear loud noises, people speaking at a tone that is uncomfortable, statistics are not going to help you.
mhm,
Okay? You have to pay attention to where you are. When you're driving, it's a choice of whether you drive or fly that you make on the basis of statistics. And we know that flying is a lot safer, right?
mhm.
But if you're behind the wheel, at that point, statistics don't matter. What matters is how you drive and how much you pay attention to the road. And you can completely outclass the statistics.
Mhm.
So,
So it might
does
be
that make
accurate to
sense?
say that, yeah, absolutely. Sounds like one kind of a way to wrap it up in a kind of a pocket, put it on a bow, is that when we are making our safety and risk decisions, it's the statistics that should be front of mind, that should drive those
Mhm.
decisions. When we are executing those decisions,
Yeah.
that's when we start engaging with our gut and our instinct and our experience.
Yeah. Paying attention. Correct.
Mhm,
That's a good, if you will, a shortcut or hack.
mhm. Yeah, outstanding. And again, one great source of statistics for folks like us, parents who's running out there, who don't have the time to go dive deep into the literature and
All right.
don't know a cop in every town we want to go visit, is the Safe Explore app, which
Explore.
will get that information
Yes.
right to our fingertips. And so thank you so much for bringing all this information today. I think it's a topic that we don't talk about enough and don't think enough about. And bringing it front and center to our viewers, I really appreciate that.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity, and I hope we stay in touch.
Absolutely. And yep, so thank you very much. Folks, I will be putting the links to the Safe Explore website and where you can get that app down in the show notes. So thank you all for watching. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you once again, sir, for coming on today.
Cheers.